All right. So we're going to go over today, guys, how transport is accomplished in a multicellular organism. We've already talked about how transport is accomplished at a cellular level, all right? And we talked about diffusion, osmosis, active transport, and then we talked about phagocytosis, pinocytosis, and receptor-mediated endocytosis, all right? You're going to find that some of those processes are still going to be involved on a large scale, okay, in terms of transport in a multicellular organism, all right? Because after all, what's a multicellular organism made out of? Cells, okay? Lots and lots of cells. So we still have to use these processes, and these processes can create forces that can be used to move even large amounts of material, all right? And that's what we're going to look at today. So we need to understand how transport within cells is similar and involved in transport in multicellular organisms. Understand how nutrients, that is water, sugar, and minerals, are transported within vascular plants. Okay? We only deal with vascular plants because they're the ones that have tubes and actually transport material by means other than diffusion. All right? So vascular plants would be basically anything except a moss, a liverwort, or a hornwort. Okay, those are considered to be non-vascular plants. Similarly, any aquatic plants would not be included in this, as they don't have to transport water, as they're surrounded by it. Okay. All right, and second last, learn the structure, the structure of vascular plants and what forces are involved in transport in them. All right, the big thing here, guys, is that when plants began to colonize land, they ran into this problem. The resources they need are spatially separated. That means they are not in the same place. Okay? Carbon dioxide and sunlight are above the ground. Water and minerals are below the ground. Okay? You have to have some way of transporting those materials from one place to the other. As an aquatic plant, you don't have that issue. Okay? As an aquatic plant, your limiting factor, okay, and that's the factor that affects that can most affect your growth, is sunlight. As a terrestrial plant, your limiting factor is going to be water. Okay, for most terrestrial plants. If you grow, on the jungle floor of a tropical rainforest, then light could be your limiting factor because you're shaded out by everybody. Okay, but for most terrestrial plants, the limiting factor is the availability of water. So they have to have some setup that will allow them to move these resources back and forth. Okay, because the parts of them that are under the ground acquiring water and minerals cannot make what? They can't make sugar. They're underground. There's no light there. Right? So the roots are not photosynthetic. Okay? They can't be. They don't have that resource. Similarly, the leaves do not have the ability to absorb water. They're above ground. They're sealed with a waxy cuticle in order to prevent water from getting out, which happens to also prevent water from getting in. All right? So they have to get it from somewhere else. What's involved is a chute system, okay, that allows them to transport between the two places. Now, plants have come up with different ways to accomplish this, okay, different strategies for survival. Some plants, like strawberries, for example, okay, raspberries also do this, will create what are called stolons. We sometimes more commonly refer to them as suckers. Okay? They're roots, essentially, or little tubes that run over to another place and start another plant growing in that spot. Okay? Not by a seed, okay, but by that plant actually physically extending its tissues over to another area and then growing another plant in that spot. All right? How many people have seen that? Okay, it's like strawberries really tend to do that. Okay, raspberries, if you have a raspberry patch, you'll find them growing up in the middle of your lawn sometimes. All right, because they just kind of grow out and they put these suckers out. Elm trees will do it to some extent. Okay, mayday trees and things like that tend to grow that way. All right, so that's one strategy for being able to acquire nutrients. Is if you exhaust the nutrients over here, you just grow this stolon over here and acquire them over here, and then you can transport them back and forth through this tube. Okay, everyone with me on that? Your other methods for survival, creating a rhizome. Okay, a rhizome allows you to store some of the materials, raw materials, well, not so much raw materials, but processed materials, okay, produced by the leaves. Okay, a rhizome can store starches and sugars and things like that that are produced here, so that when maybe conditions are not so good above ground, the plant can still survive on this stored energy. All right, potatoes are the same thing. All right? Potatoes are the way that plants store energy. We store energy as fat. Plants store energy as starch. Okay? Starch is plant fat. So potatoes are fat plants. Okay? They store lots and lots of energy in the tubers, that's the potato, okay, underground. Now, can you plant a plant from a potato? Yes, you can. Okay? Potatoes will produce seeds as well. They make blossoms and they make seeds from those. But you can also plant them by just cutting a potato in half and throwing it in the ground, okay, and it'll grow from there, right? Because there's a lot of stored energy in a potato. Right? Enough that the plant can grow from it the next season, okay, after winter kills off the green parts of it. Okay? And you've probably seen this if you've ever left potatoes in your pantry for too long. Right? They start to get the little eyes on them, and then if you leave them for a really long time, you come back and it looks like a giant spider. Right? Because they've got the sprouts that are going everywhere and they're all kind of purple. Okay? And they're looking for a way to get out and get into the sunlight. In fact, sometimes they'll have little purple leaves on them even, okay, as they're looking for a way to get into the sun and get another source of energy, okay, because they've used up all the stored energy in the potato to grow. Okay, another way to survive, okay, kind of adverse conditions would be onions. Okay, onions don't necessarily store starch because onions are sweet. Okay? They actually store the sugars produced in the leaves in the base of the leaves in this fleshy part that we usually use for cooking and eating. All right? So sugars get stored in there, which is why onions are sweet. All right. So again, the resources that the plants need are not in the same place. They've got to acquire water and minerals here. They've got to make their sugars up here. All right? So they've got to be able to transport back and forth. Okay, another adaptation. Plants need light. And once there's lots of plants in an area, they have to compete for it. And the way you compete for light is to grow tall. Okay? Now, if you're going to grow tall, you've got to be able to support yourself. Okay? Now, you can probably see from the plants I have around this room here that growing tall becomes a problem. If you don't have a special type of trunk like this dragon palm does, okay, what happens to you when you start to get too tall? You just fall over. Right? Because you can't support the weight of your own tissue. Okay? These little ficus plants here, okay, they've got strong stems. Right? They're made out of wood. Whereas these plants here, right, they can't support weight. You let them go and they just fall. Right? Because these are surviving solely on the strength of their cell walls and the Turgor pressure within their water vacuoles. That's good as long as you're not going to be more than a couple of feet tall. If you're going to be a tree, that is not going to cut it. Okay? You're going to have to produce something else that can cement your cell walls together, right, and make them even stronger. That stuff is lignin. Okay? Lignin is a hard type of protein material that we usually know as wood. Okay? It's essentially what allows a plant to become wood-like. Okay? And once it is wood-like, it can support large amounts of weight, is still reasonably flexible, right? And can get very, very tall as a result. Okay? I mean, if you look at like a giant sequoia or redwood or anything like that, any of those really, really tall trees, obviously they have very strong trunks. Okay? And that's because they secrete lots of lignin into the cell walls, and then over years and years and years that builds up, okay, and becomes very big, okay, and also very strong. And that supports this tree even in strong winds. Okay? In strong winds, it's even somewhat flexible, and the tree can sway back and forth. Right? Now, some trees obviously are better suited to that than others. Right? Spruce trees tend to be reasonably flexible, right? But they're not very aerodynamic. Okay? In a strong wind, spruce trees can be broken. Right? Deciduous trees like poplar trees and things like that are quite a bit more flexible, okay? But still in a very strong wind can be broken. Or if a freak snowfall happens in the first week of September, okay, and the weight of all that snow on their branches still holding leaves hits them, then of course they're only so flexible, right? And then they'll snap as well. One of the most flexible trees is the palm tree. Okay, if you've ever seen a palm tree in a hurricane, I mean, they snap back and forth and they don't seem to ever fall over or break. Okay, but they have to. They grow in an area where hurricanes are common. Okay, and they've got to be able to adapt to that. Okay, other types of trees, they'll adapt simply by growing into the wind. Okay, or actually downwind. a little bit. Right? If you go down to southern Alberta, especially if you go into kind of the foothills, just like we're on Pincher Creek and stuff, you'll see that a lot of the trees are kind of bent towards the east. Okay? They just grow that way because it makes them a little more aerodynamic because the wind usually comes from the west. Okay? And you'll see trees that are just naturally bent that way, okay, as an adaptation. Okay, but lignin, again, helps to make them strong. Some plants use it to encase their seeds in, all right? Pine cones, okay, things like that, okay? Is this very hard substance that degrades slowly. Okay. All right, the Turgor pressure, okay, that we talked about here, and show you kind of a more in-depth picture of what that looks like. Okay? So Turgor pressure is the pressure of the water within the vacuoles. Obviously, that supports the green parts of any plant, okay? Whether it's a spruce tree, a giant sequoia, a poplar tree, okay? The house plants in your house, whatever. Turgor pressure supports the leafy green tissue, okay? And keeps it from looking wilted. All right, so if we've got this flower here, okay, when it's healthy, its water vacuoles, and there often tend to be more than one, okay, are full of water. They're creating turgor pressure, and they're pushing the contents of the cell against the cell wall. Okay, like so. And that's helping to keep the cell wall upright, because the cell wall by itself is not strong enough to support stuff. Okay, it needs that turgor pressure from within. As the plant becomes stressed for water, okay, some of those water vacuoles may begin to empty a little bit. All right, and as a result, that pressure that was present in the first diagram is not as great, and so the plant begins to wilt. When the situation becomes extreme and water has been drawn out of the water vacuoles, the cell membrane will begin to pull away from the cell wall, which is actually a reversal of the desired situation. Instead of being pushed against the cell wall, now it's pulling the cell wall in, all right? And that results in the plant beginning to look like this, okay? Completely wilted. Can that plant recover? Yep. A plant will only not recover if it is crunchy. Once it is crunchy, then it's done. Okay? But if it's still fleshy, at least a little bit, okay, you can usually save it with an addition of sufficient water. All right, so this would be what happens if they do not have that skeleton of lignified walls, right? Or it's just the leaves of the plant. All right. Roots, first part of the plant we'll talk about. What's the job of the roots? Two things. Acquire water and nutrients, and support or anchor the plant. Okay. Sometimes plants are strong enough that they don't break in the wind, but they still tip over. You ever seen trees get uprooted? Okay. Pulled right out by their roots, okay, by the wind. All right, roots are very strong. It takes a lot to pull the roots of a plant out of the ground. All right, you probably know this if you ever tried to pull like a dandelion, okay, or something like that out of the ground, or try a thistle with gloves on. Okay, if you try and pull out a Canada thistle, right, they're nasty. They can have roots that are 4 to 6 feet deep, depending on the soil type. All right, and yeah, they're nasty. And if you miss any part of that root, it'll grow back. Okay. I used to work at a golf course, and I had to spray for weeds and stuff like that, so I learned all this stuff. But it was crazy, okay, how strong Canada thistle could be and how deep their roots could go. Once in a while, they'd grow in the sand traps and the bunkers, and they can grow roots really deep through that kind of soft sand. And it was just, you just keep pulling this thing. It was like a magic trick, okay? It just kept coming and coming and coming when you were pulling it out. All right, there's two different kinds of roots, though, okay? There are what we call tap roots, like this one, and fibrous roots, like this one. Okay? Each serve a different purpose, right? They're an adaptation to a certain lifestyle. If you are, let's say, a very large tree, are you going to want a fibrous root or a tap root? That's what most people think. The last time you saw a tree tipped over, what kind of roots did it have? Fibrous, yeah. It's actually better to spread out over a wide area if you're a large tree, because you can hang on better, right? If you have a tap root and in the wind the top starts to sway, what happens to the bottom? it starts to move too, and it'll eventually just wiggle the tree right out. Okay, it'd be how you'd maybe like pull a nail. All right, you kind of wiggle the nail back and forth, and you can kind of work the bottom of it as well as the top, and it gets loose, and you can pull it out. All right, so yeah, if you're really, really big, you generally don't want a taproot. Generally, the things that have taproots are smaller. Lots of weeds have taproots. Okay, carrots, turnips, beets. Okay, if you're storing energy in your roots, okay, other than as a tuber, so like a potato, all right, you're going to store it in a taproot. So these have the ability to store a lot more energy. Okay, they tend to be a lot deeper as well. All right, that can be good and bad. All right, if you're a desert plant, are you going to want a taproot or a fibrous root? Yeah, you actually want a fibrous root. Most desert plants have a fibrous root that is actually very shallow. Right? The saguaro cactus, okay, the one you see on like the taco time sign with the arms, okay, those have a fibrous root system, and the roots can sometimes be up to 100 meters away from the plant. They can extend up to 100 meters away, and they're right at the surface. Because when it rains, they want to get the water. All right, doesn't rain very often, but when it does rain, they want to gobble it up right away. If they've got a taproot, all they've done is extend a root down into soil that will always be dry. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions. There are a few bushes that grow in the desert that have taproots that can go deep enough that they'll tap like an aquifer or a well. Okay, occasionally we'll tap groundwater sources. Mesquite will do that. All right. Okay, fibrous roots tend to be a bit more common, all right, for a couple of reasons. They increase the surface area over which moisture can be absorbed. A taproot doesn't have as much surface area. You usually see little root hairs coming off of them, okay, and that helps them to increase their surface area a little bit, but obviously a fibrous root system has got a greater surface area for the absorption of nutrients and water. And you can grow fibrous roots in any direction. Right? So if one side of the plant tends to have more moisture than the other, it'll tend to grow roots more on that side than on the other side, whereas you can't do that with a taproot. Okay? So there's a few advantages to being fibrous, but fibrous roots can't store as much energy as a taproot can. All right? So it's depending on kind of what situation you're in there. The other thing that you'll sometimes find on fibrous root systems are these little nodules here. Okay? You won't find those on a taproot. Those nodules contain bacteria. And those bacteria can take nitrogen out of the air and convert it into nitrates, which the plant requires. That's what's in fertilizer. Okay? Ammonium and nitrates, the source of nitrogen for plants. All right? So when you put fertilizer on a plant, that's what you're giving them, is nitrates and ammonium. Okay? And they like that, and they get really green. Okay? These types of plants, okay, have bacteria that will do that for them. Typically, your legumes will do that. So peas, beans, okay, and things like that will have those on them. And oftentimes, farmers will rotate their crops, and part of the rotation will be to grow like field peas or field beans, because it will naturally replenish the nitrogen content of the soil, especially if they've just grown something that's very nutrient demanding, like canola, okay, or something like that. Growing the next year something that will replenish some of that soil will reduce the amount of fertilizer they have to use the following year. Okay, so it's kind of a smart thing to do. I do that in my garden. Okay, I actually when I plant my peas and beans, I plant them one row over each year. Okay, so that I'm always cycling where that kind of nutrients can be put back in. Right? Because when you harvest them, do you harvest the roots? No. So these things that are full of nitrogen remain in the ground, they break down, and they release the nitrogen into the soil. All right, so that's what roots do. Okay, anchor the plant, absorb minerals and water, conduct water and nutrients, store food. Okay, stems. Stems are the highway. They're the transport system between the two places where all the business gets done. Okay, roots are acquiring the raw materials. Leaves are producing the products that are needed by the rest of the plant. There's got to be a way to transport that between them, and that's what the stem's job is. The stem is also there to support, okay, any high growth that the plant may require. And the stem also is where the stem cells, okay, meristems is what they're called, okay, will reside, and those can control growth, okay, of further leaf tissue or more stem tissue or whatever is needed by the plant. Now, the other day I told you about how if a plant was, let's say, eaten, it would grow from the buds again later, okay, and this is a picture of that. I actually found it the other day, okay. So you can see here that these are the little buds, and this top piece gets cut off right here. Right? So that's where it was cut off, and you can see that 2 new branches with lots of leaf tissue actually grew from those 2 buds further down. Okay. So, main purpose of the stems, got to support the plant, transport nutrients from the roots to the leaves, and vice versa. Okay, doesn't say that here, but they also have to transport sugar from leaves to roots. All right, so the plant's stem is like a 4-lane divided highway. Part of it transports water up, and part of it transports sugar down. Those 2 jobs cannot be accomplished in one set of tubes, right? Because then you'd have stuff trying to go 2 ways in the same tube. All right, you guys follow me there? Right? Like the LRT in Calgary, you know, yeah, it's only got 1 tunnel, but there's 2 tracks in the tunnel. Right? You wouldn't want trains going 2 different directions on the same track. That's not good. Well, you can't have that happen in a plant either. Okay? There's a separate set of tubes for transporting sugar, and there's a separate set of tubes for transporting water. The xylem transports water, the phloem transports sugar. We'll talk about those in just a minute. All right, the leaves. Okay, this is a better diagram of the one I showed you the other day, okay, showing the layers of the leaf. And we said that the layers of the leaf was going to be important. Right? I'm not concerned if you remember the name mesophyll or not. I'm concerned if you remember palisade layer, okay, and spongy layer, right? Because those are 2 main parts of the leaf. The palisade layer is that layer we looked at in the cell anatomy lab. That is where the photosynthesis, or the bulk of it, takes place because it's on the top of the leaf. The spongy layer, okay, has got lots of space within it, and it is exactly like a sponge. It pulls in moisture and can hold it, and it also has pore spaces to hold carbon dioxide for when it's needed for photosynthesis, and it allows oxygen to get out through the stomates, okay, which you see down here at the bottom. Okay, you see the guard cells and the stomate in there on the bottom of the leaf. Okay, what you also see is a veinlet coming into the leaf here, and we've got on the outside the tubes that transport sugar, and on the inside the tubes that transport water. All right. The reason the tubes on the outside transport sugar is harder to have diffuse. All right. So we don't want it to diffuse too far. It gets into these tubes and it can be transported down. Plus, we don't want that sap to get really, really thick. So if water has to diffuse through those cells and through those tubes to get to the other parts of the plant, so much the better. It'll keep that sap runny, okay, and not clog the tubes. Everyone follow me on that one? Okay, so make sure you know the layers of the leaf here. You've got the cuticle, that waxy stuff on the outside. The upper epidermis is what secretes that. Same on the bottom, lower epidermis and cuticle. Okay, on the bottom you still have your stomates and guard cells, spongy layer, palisade layer. Okay, know what all the layers do. Now, this diagram over here is showing a different type of leaf. Okay, this is your more common leaf called a C3 leaf. Okay, C4 or cam leaves are usually the kind that are involved in what we call xerophytes, which are plants that live in very dry conditions. Their structure is different in order to conserve water. Okay, so we don't see, you can see that their stomates look different. Okay, they're actually made up of 4 cells instead of 2. Right? That keeps a tighter seal and allows less evaporation. Okay? You can see that the palisade layer and the spongy layer are arranged in a ring around the xylem tubes. Right? And actually that the spongy layer actually does a little bit of conducting of sugar, okay, in these types of plants, but we don't study those. It's just to show you that there are different kinds. All right. Questions on the leaf? Sorry, one last thing here. If you're looking at the leaf kind of from a macro perspective, that's a leaf, by the way. Okay, this is the blade. All right. This is the stalk, and this part here, where it attaches to the branch, is the petiole. All right, those terms are mentioned up here, just so you know what I mean by those. All right, so transport in plants. You have this diagram, right? I put it in your notes package. Believe I did. Yeah. Okay, so this diagram here is showing you the processes that are going to go on to transport water and minerals. Okay, so we'll start down here at the roots at step number 1. Okay, step number 1, we got water working its way into the roots of the plant. That's accomplished a bit by osmosis, a bit by diffusion, okay? And we've got that water essentially moves into the root tissue. From the root tissue, it will move its way into the xylem tubes, okay? And the xylem tubes are the ones that are going to pull water up the plant. Here's the trick. How are you going to pull water up a plant? Plants don't have a heart. They don't have a pump. What's going to pull water, especially if, like, for a tall tree, all the way up to the leaves? It's sort of like a siphon, but the way that we get the pressure isn't the same as a siphon. Yeah, you're on the right track here. It has to do with what happens when water evaporates. It creates sort of a siphon effect, but it's an osmotic siphon. Okay, so we're using osmosis here. That cellular transport process that draws water across a membrane to balance salt is the same process that creates enough force to draw water, in some cases hundreds of feet, up the stem of a plant or the trunk of a tall tree. Right? So what happens is water evaporates up here at the leaves. And when it does that, it leaves behind anything that was dissolved in it. Okay? Because plants aren't picking up distilled water out of the soil. The water that comes into them from the soil contains salts, minerals, and whatever else. When the water evaporates, those don't go with it. They stay behind in the spongy layer. Right? So, if suddenly a bunch of salt has been left there, what's going to happen? Water will move by osmosis out of the xylem and into the spongy layer cells, okay, in order to balance the salt concentrations. Water's what kind of a molecule? Polar. Okay. It creates hydrogen bonds with itself. We call that cohesion. So, as the water molecules move to balance the salt concentration, they pull on every other water molecule all the way down the xylem, drawing them up like a barrel of monkeys. Okay, you know how you hook the barrel of monkeys? We talked about that in the chem unit, right? Okay, they're all attached and they're being pulled up by the ones at the top. Now, if we're talking about a column of water that is 100 feet, okay, so that's 30 meters, okay, that's 30 meters tall, can this column of water be very thick? No. Okay, these hydrogen bonds are weak. Right? They're not very strong at all. So we have to be talking about a column of water that's very, very thin. In fact, microscopically so. The xylem tubes are not tubes you'd see with the naked eye. Okay? You'd see them through a microscope and they would look like this. All right, so on the inside of a tree trunk, there's a whole bunch of these tubes, but they're all microscopic. If you've ever cut down a tree, you didn't look in and go, ooh, tubes, okay? Because you can't see them with the naked eye. They're that small, all right? This column of water has got to be very narrow. Think about this. If you had a straw that was 1 meter long, what are your chances of being able to draw water up by creating a suction? And could you drink water through a 1 meter long straw? Probably not. Okay, because you can't create that much of a pressure differential, that much suction with just your mouth. All right, so you would need either a shorter straw or a narrower straw. Okay, because if you've ever had like a blizzard or like a milkshake, really thick one, okay, as soon as you try and create a suction, what does the straw do? Right? It just collapses under your own pressure. All right. Well, imagine trying to support a column of water. Okay, let's say that big around, but that's 1 meter tall. I mean, that could be a whole liter of water. Do you think you could support a liter of water by suction? Okay? It's too heavy. Right? So that's why these tubes have to be so thin, so that the column of water within them is very, very small. Okay? And then those hydrogen bonds can attach the molecules to each other and also to the inside of the tubes, and that helps support that column of water. But as soon as it gets too big, the middle of the column will collapse because the hydrogen bonds aren't strong enough, and then all the water falls back down. Okay? Everyone with me there? All right, so it's an osmotic pulling force that draws the water up the plant. Now, as that water is evaporating, these two gases are being exchanged. Carbon dioxide for oxygen. Okay? Sorry, oxygen for carbon dioxide. The oxygen is going out, the carbon dioxide is coming in because photosynthesis is occurring. Okay, light's coming in, it's breaking up the carbon dioxide, it's releasing, okay, oxygen from water, okay, into the atmosphere and making sugar. Now, the sugar goes back down the tree trunk in the phloem tubes. Okay, the phloem tubes are out near the outside. That's why the sap usually is on the outside of the tree. Okay, the really sticky stuff, right, is near the outside. That's where the phloem tubes are. Okay. What force do you suppose they use to do that? Gravity, yeah, that's free. Okay, gravity is free, so that's what's used here. It's just the simple weight of the sap is pulling it down. All right, so these, I think you have this list, right? You have this numbered list. All right, so they correspond to the numbers on that diagram. So that's what we talked about. The roots absorb water and minerals. The roots exchange gases, okay? The roots are carrying out what we call cellular respiration. They're burning sugar, using oxygen to do that, and releasing carbon dioxide. Same process that goes on in our cells. Okay, water and minerals are transported upward as xylem sap within the xylem. Okay, transpiration, evaporation of water happen, and that's what pulls, okay, all those other forces. That creates that osmotic pulling force. Maybe we'll write that that's an osmotic pulling force. Okay. Leaves exchange gases, okay, sugar is produced, and then sugar goes down through the phloem, okay, to the other non-photosynthetic parts of the plants. Okay, questions there? All right, so transport in plants. Two tissues, like we said, are the phloem and the xylem. And you can see here in this diagram that the xylem is the interior part of the stem. The phloem is the exterior part of the stem. All right, so the phloem is actually living tissue, and the xylem is actually dead phloem cells. Right? So the xylem tissue is actually not really living tissue anymore. It's old phloem tissue. Okay, and because where does a plant grow from? Does the plant grow from the center, or does it add to the outside? No, if it grew from the center, it would always crack, right? Because it would push and break the outer layers. A plant grows by adding to the outside. That's why you see rings when you cut down a tree. Okay, each ring represents where the outside of that tree was in a growing season. You want to follow me there? Okay, that's why when they cut down like a really, really old tree, it can give them climate information going back almost 1,000 years, depending on how old the tree is. Okay, and what they look at is how wide are the rings. If they see a bunch of rings that are very widely spaced, they know there were a bunch of years in a row where temperatures were high, rainfall was good, and the plant grew a lot. Okay, if they see a bunch of very small spaced rings, then that tells them there were several very bad growing seasons. Maybe it was very cold, okay, things like that, and they can analyze from there, right? But that's because the plant grows from the outside. It adds new phloem essentially each year, and then as the plant gets bigger, phloem eventually becomes xylem. All right, so xylem's on the inside. Okay, and this is that process that we were talking about here. Okay, the xylem transports water up the plant. Okay, and that process involves osmosis, cohesion, and adhesion. Okay, so as water evaporates from the leaves, the remaining solution in the xylem becomes more concentrated, or in the spongy layer becomes more concentrated, and that pulls water up by osmosis to balance that salt concentration. Within the xylem, at a microscopic level, okay, this is what we're seeing. We got hydrogen bonds between water molecules. That's cohesion, holding them together. There's also hydrogen bonds between water molecules in the inside of the xylem. That's adhesion. Okay, and obviously then there's the osmotic pulling force that's drawing the water upwards, okay, through these. It doesn't really create a vacuum, though. Remember that the stomates are open to the outside, right? So if water just evaporates, there's not really a, other than the osmotic part, there's not a vacuum produced, okay? Right? Because there's still air in the spongy layer. With me on that? So yeah, it's not a suction at all. It's an osmotic pull. Okay. All right, and it's a similar process inside the roots that allows them to take up water. Okay, because as water is pulled away and up towards the leaves, it's leaving behind salts and things like that, and so water comes in from the soil, okay, into the roots. That's why you typically don't see plants growing very well in very salty soils. Right? If you've ever seen like when a slough dries up, there's that kind of layer of white stuff. Okay? That's actually minerals that are left behind that were dissolved in the water, and it's very difficult for plants to grow in that soil because they have trouble setting up a balance, or setting up an imbalance, sorry, that will allow osmosis to pull water into the plant. Because if there's a lot of salt at the roots, which way does the water want to go? Out. Yeah, it wants to go to the salt, and it actually gets drawn out of the roots and just shrivels the plant right up. Okay. All right, and then the phloem, like we said, it transports the sugars that are made in the leaves down the plant. Okay, we don't need any other fancy forces, just gravity. Okay, that'll do the job for us. Okay, the process is slow, not nearly as fast as water goes up because the sap is viscous. That's thick. Okay, and so it has to be transported more slowly. What does the plant do in the wintertime? Does the plant want to have a bunch of water in the inside of its stem in the winter? No, because water will expand, freeze inside, and break the tree. So, as a plant begins to lose its leaves and go dormant, it's no longer carrying out photosynthesis. Okay? And if it's no longer carrying out photosynthesis, there's nothing to draw water up the tree anymore. And actually, it dries out. Right? So there's no water in the xylem usually during the winter. What about the phloem sap, though? Is there still sticky sap in there? There is, but because it's so thick and so full of sugar, its freezing point is much, much lower. Okay? It almost acts like an antifreeze and keeps it from expanding inside. Plus, that's also the living part of the tree, which tends to be a bit more flexible. Right? And so you get a little bit more expansion there. And since it's lost its leaves, and it's not producing any more sugar, the bulk of that phloem sap is already transported down, okay, and the plant's going dormant, so it's not using it anymore. Okay, like we said here, some osmosis and diffusion is still required, and that's of course why, sorry, that's not why, so what happens is water can move from the xylem out into the phloem tubes to change the viscosity of the phloem sap. If the phloem sap gets too thick, water will naturally move by osmosis to balance that out a little bit and cause that sap to get a little thinner, and it'll run a little easier. All right, so these 5 questions here, let's have you guys start on those. We may not get a chance to go over them as a class, but if we don't, we'll go over them on Monday. What's due on Monday? Cell anatomy lab. Okay, make sure you got that one done. Okay, and if you didn't get your cell size one done, get it done as soon as possible and get it submitted as well. Yeah, the cell size one was due today.